Okay. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Socksci 100 Week 15.2. So, I apologize if my voice is a bit not clear. I hope it is audible on your part. Um, I think I have a cold. Hopefully, it is a cold. Haven't had test yet, but what I want to do for this particular session is to pick up on our discussion from last week. And we talked about, not last week, last Tuesday. And we talked about Immanuel Kant. We talked about the concept of autonomy. And we talked about how he deploys this kind of concept as a form of negative freedom against the backdrop of the Enlightenment crisis. So during that time, of course, Immanuel Kant saw that there are some forces, there are some powers that exert influence or control over individual human beings, so much so that they could not decide for themselves. And those things are very explicit. For those of you who have had the chance to read the text, or if you've browsed through the text, you'd see that going further through the paragraphs that or the sections that we've read, you'd see that Kant describes this exertion of power as a kind of the culture of obedience. Okay, so this is remember that Kant was writing in the 1780s, and those things were explicit, and we were contrasting that last Tuesday with more implicit forms of control, right? And of course, it's very difficult to identify implicit or subtle forms of control because these are things that we usually don't immediately see as forms of control. No, I'm not sure if I've given you an example. Um, there is, for instance, this Slavoj Žižek again makes use of this example, or tries to illustrate this problem by talking about the difference between a traditional, for example, a traditional father, traditional parent, or and a this postmodern new wave kind of father. Okay, so what does he mean by that? What does he mean when he says there's a difference between the two? So let's consider this particular example. The traditional father would tell you, I don't know if you've had this experience when when you were a child. The father will tell you, I don't care how you feel, bumangon ka dyan, aalis tayo ngayon, bibisita tayo kay lola mo, and so on and so on. It's a very direct, explicit command, right? On the other hand, the postmodern, for lack of a better term, the postmodern father would say, well, it's really up to you. You know how much your grandmother loves you. You should only really visit when you really, really, really want to visit your grandmother. So there are those are two different, forms of control, because the other one is very subtle, right? The other one is very subtle, and you wouldn't see it as a kind of an explicit command. So it's more powerful in the sense that it doesn't just tell you what to do. It tells you that you have to like what you're doing, right? In the very same way that if you see, this traditional boss as an authority figure versus the modern day postmodern contemporary boss, which is, befriends all employees. So if this particular boss, hangs out with his employees, he is friends with them, then the order of the boss, yung mga utos ng boss na yun, doesn't really come across as orders, as commands. They come across as requests, and sometimes that's where employees get exploited. So those are two very different forms of control. And last week in Kant, we were talking about a very explicit form of control, right? And because it's very obvious, that's the reason why Kant was telling us that, uh, the subscription to the culture of obedience is a result of laziness and cowardice. Of course, that's true to a certain extent, but we have to challenge that kind of idea now because there are, again, different forms of control. In applying that to our own context, no, to the local context, it's not really the case that um, those who voted for Marcos, for instance, are just lazy and they just don't want to read the stuff that Robredo supporters would share on Facebook, right? The facts, the credentials, and so on. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's an underlying systemic form of subtle control, manipulation, even that we have yet to find. We have yet to articulate, right? We have yet to see. So the reason why we have a lot of people, again, I'm not when I say we, I mean in general, reason why we have a very simple understanding of the problem, and in fact what happens now is further divide, right, is because we fail to understand the sort of the underlying problems that animate this kind of situation that we are in. We fail to dig deeper, for lack of a better term. And because of that, we tend to simplify things. Okay. I don't know if I told you this last Tuesday, but I wanted to share with you something which I think is a brilliant metaphor for like our condition. Um, so this is actually like this is just a joke, right? It's a joke that communicates or that tells us something very important, something very something very thought provoking. Okay, so let me read this to you. In This is from, again, from Slavoj Žižek. In an old joke from the defunct German Democratic Republic, a German worker gets a job in Siberia. Aware of how all mail will be read by censors, he tells his friends, "Let's establish a code. If a letter you will get from me is written in ordinary blue ink, it is true. If it is written in red ink, it is false." After a month, so take note of the distinction, right? Blue ink is true, red ink is false. Now to continue, after a month, his friends get the first letter written in blue ink. It says, "Everything is wonderful here. Stores are full, food is abundant, apartments are large and properly heated, movie theaters show films from the West. There are many beautiful girls ready for an affair. And the only thing missing, the only thing unavailable is red ink." Okay. Now, before you continue reading the second paragraph, just from that alone, from that last line, the only unavailable thing is the red ink. It's quite telling, isn't it? Right? Because there seems to be a subtle hint there that had there been red ink, I would have written this in red ink. No, so it's a kind of the uh, it's a kind of a joke that um tries to communicate to us something incomplete, but at the same time expects us to complete it. So Zizek says here, "And is this not our situation till now? We have all the freedoms one wants. The only thing missing is the red ink." So, and this is something that I said last Tuesday, we feel free because we lack the very language to articulate our unfreedom. What is lack of red ink means is that today, all the main terms we use to designate the present conflict, war on terror, democracy and freedom, human rights, etc., these are false terms, mystifying our perception of the situation instead of allowing us to think it. The task today is to give the protesters the red ink. So, to a great extent, what the texts of Adorno would try to provide is, I think, that particular kind of red ink, right? Because we lack the language to understand what makes us unfree in the first place. So if you think about it, there needs to be some sort of a, if we want real change, right? If we want real transformation, societal transformation to happen, what we first need to have is something epistemically revolutionary, changing the way we think about the situation. Because again, let me put it quite simply, for people who never saw the Marcos dictatorship as a problem, there's really no problem for them if Bongbong, comes to power or gets to power. So what does that tell us, right? Can we solve it by simply, making tons of books available, tons of documentaries available? I think that's a good effort. That's a great way of dealing with things. But on the other hand, there are also certain material conditions that prevent people from being able to access that, right? And again, this is part of my general observation. It might not be in your network, it might not be in your own circles or social media algorithms. But when I see this, I feel kind of um, you know confused as to why some people couldn't see this, because some of them express their frustrations. Of course, it's not to invalidate them, but when they express their frustrations, it's as if everyone has the luxury of time, the privilege, the means to read all these books, to access these documentaries and so on. If someone is working two or three, jobs, 2 jobs a day or 3 jobs a day, maybe the breaks that will be used will be allotted for, a quick cigarette break or a quick, scroll through social media, which is a platform wherein misinformation is proliferated. So there are material conditions that I think we fail to understand. That's why, like, the success of Marcos, if you follow the news, and then we learned that there's no irregularity in the counting of votes, in the canvassing of ballots. There's no irregularity because what we are probably getting is the real thing. But the real thing is something that has been already manipulated right from the start, right? If because they were able to circumvent that kind of electoral process. So um, again, this is a subtle form of control, right? If right at the outset, leading survey agencies would present Marcos as already winning, as already leading, that affects the cognitive positions of voters. And kaya nga kahit nung mismong bilangan ng what do you call this, ng boto, kahit hindi pa nagsisimula yung pagbilang ng boto, pinapakita na leading si Marcos. And that can't be traced to any government agency because it's proliferated by troll farms. A lot of it is proliferated in social media, right? So technically, they can't be accountable, no. Um, so the sort of control, again, subtle form of control, affects the very cognitive processes of humans. Okay. And it's something we have to be aware of. But the question is, how can we be aware of it? Kant wrote the text What is Enlightenment in 1780, 1784. Nearly 2 centuries later, Germany found itself in the same problem, right? In the problem of Hitler. But Hitler was not, I mean, he did not come to power as a tyrant. You know what I mean? He came to power as someone who was able to convince the people. And therein lies the subtle form of control. So by the 1940s, state institutions in Germany have become complicit in perpetuating this sort of narrative, this sort of control. You find it in literature, you find it in pop culture, you find it in schools, you find it in church, etc. Kaya nga, when they describe, and I hope you're familiar with the Holocaust, the systematic killing of the Jews. when they organized that, when they orchestrated that, like the term systematic is a very fitting term to describe it, because it was not just, random killing and stuff. Okay. So before I go to Theodore Adorno, we're going to try and cover two texts today. I'm not sure if you've read it. Has anyone browsed it? Maybe just a couple of paragraphs, either text. Meron ba? You can be honest. That's all right. I mean, I will be discussing the text anyway, but just to see maybe your level of familiarity with the text. Has anyone had a chance to maybe look into it? Just paragraphs or not necessarily the whole thing? Quick show of hands kung meron. Okay, so Irish was able to Irish had a chance to read it. So apart from Irish, are there still others? Okay. So we'll try to be to go slower through the text so that you can at least follow me. But again, these are very easy texts to read. We'll provide context. So what I will do is I'll provide first contextual information about Holocaust and then about Adorno so that you know why we are talking about Adorno. Um, okay, hold on for a bit. So the first video I'm going to show you is about the Holocaust. A short 3-minute video. Of course, it contains some quite disturbing stuff. So that's the trigger warning. If you are uncomfortable seeing these kinds of things, please feel free to tune out for a while and come back after 3 minutes. Okay. I'm not sure if I shared the sound. There.
From Belsen, the scene changes to Auschwitz in Poland, where Kramer and others were previously employed. Behind the lines of barbed wire, more than 4 million men, women, and children were scientifically murdered by gassing. In this camp, victims torn to pieces by savage dogs. Extermination was the fate of all who were not fit to be active beasts of burden for the Reich. Sick and old persons and pregnant women went straight to the gas chamber. Everything at Auschwitz was done with hideous precision, even to the slave numbers on their arms.
Jetzt gehen sie wieder zurück ins Leben.
Of opening the first trial in history.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. Their fate is described by witness Rudolf Hess.
I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943 and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning.
Why? So for those of you who have like the faintest idea about like the atrocities of Hitler, that was a short clip um, about how the Germans, because of their belief of the superiority of the Aryan race, thought that the Jews are like contaminants, or the Jews are like contaminating the purity of their culture. And so the only solution was to come up with a systematic, as you've seen in the video, calculated way of exterminating the Jews. And the Germans hideously called it the final solution. Right? The Auschwitz is the final solution. It's a concentration camp. And there's a lot of like, of course, there's a lot of horror about that kind of atrocity. And the thing is that we shouldn't, say that other similar atrocities are less valuable simply because, you know, it had less number of casualties. Of course, Hitler's atrocities remain, it remains to be very notable. It remains in the memory of people. And next week, I'm thinking of talking about actually memory from that psychoanalytic perspective, because it seems something that we're not yet matured. We don't have the maturity to understand what memory means, or what memory has, insofar as its relation to justice is concerned. you know uh, in the recent decades, it was debated whether the concentration camps would be abolished. Of course, it's no longer operational, but the Germans thought that those things shouldn't be abolished. And it's not because, the primary reason why they didn't want to abolish it, even after decades after Auschwitz, decades after the Holocaust, is because they wanted to serve as the wound of Germany. Like, they wanted it to serve as the painful memory, a memory of the atrocities they committed against humanity. So they wanted it there. Like, it's a permanent defect for them. It's not something that they could forgive and forget. And the reason why I thought about this is because, you know, even in the early vice presidential campaigns of Bongbong Marcos, kumakalat na yung narrative ng forgive and forget, no? And it's a bit, of course, it's a bit scary when Amy Marcos said that their top priority is their name, right? After the proclamation, that's what Amy said, to clear the misconceptions. And that's the systemic problem that we have in the Philippines, because we do not have a monument for the atrocities that the Marcos dictatorship committed, because we're so divided, because the country is so divided, because, again, there's a lot of systemic subtle controls going around. So we're going to talk about today two texts by Theodore Adorno related to this. Um, Irish. Uh, could you elaborate your would you like to elaborate your question, Irish?
Sir, if it's related to Eugene's, the whole-
Sorry.
if it's related lang po to the Eugene's, yung Holocaust.
Oh yes, yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. It is. It is. Kasi nga it's a kind of what do you call this, yung advocacy of racial purification. So it is related to that, definitely. But yeah, and so of course, writing or doing philosophy, doing social sciences after Auschwitz, there's a bit of a feeling of desolation. Like how can social sciences, humanities, literature, art, poetry, whatever, how can it function against the backdrop of Auschwitz, against the backdrop of the Holocaust? Like how can they like do that? Because humanities is supposed to be, and the social sciences are supposed to be the cultivators of humankind, and it failed, right? So against the backdrop of that, um, systematic killings, against the backdrop of that systematic horrors, a lot of thinkers in the 60s, in the 50s, even in the 40s, but they were very limited, focused on that. Like, how can we understand the problems that we are in? No? So today we're going to talk about a German philosopher, a 20th century German philosopher, critical theorist, sociologist. This person, dabbles in a lot of things, and is quite very notable for it. I'm not sure if anyone has heard about Theodor Adorno here. Um, uh, I don't know if he's being mentioned in, for example, media studies, because he did have some interesting insights on film. He did have some interesting insights on, like, what he calls the culture industry. So I'm going to share with you another short video. This time it's not so horrifying. Um, it is a short introductory video on Theodor Adorno. So for those of you who do not know Adorno, maybe it will help you appreciate more why we're going to talk about Adorno today. So um,
Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno was born in Frankfurt in 1903 into a wealthy and cultured family. His father, a wine merchant, was of Jewish origin but had converted to Protestantism at university. Until his 20s, Adorno planned for a career as a composer, but eventually focused on philosophy. In 1934, he was barred on racial grounds from teaching in Germany, so he moved to Oxford and later to New York and then Los Angeles. He was both fascinated and repelled by Californian consumer culture and thought with unusual depth about suntans and drive-ins. Adorno was closely connected with a pioneering Institute of Social Research, also known as the Frankfurt School, which had been founded and funded by his friend Felix Weil. The institute aimed to develop a psychological understanding of the problems thrown up by modern capitalism, especially the culture and mindset it generates. Adorno drew attention to three significant ways in which capitalism corrupts and degrades us. Adorno believed that the primary focus for progressive philosophers should be the study of how the working and middle classes of developed nations think and feel, and in particular, the manner in which they spend their evenings and weekends. Adorno had a highly ambitious view of what leisure time should be for. It was not to relax and take one's mind off things. Free time should be our prime opportunity to expand and develop ourselves, to reach after our better nature, and to acquire the tools with which to change society. It's a time when we might see films that can help us to understand our relationships with new clarity, or read books that give us fresh insights into politics, or listen to music that gives us courage to reform ourselves and collective life. But in the modern world, Adorno bemoaned that leisure has fallen into the hands of an omnipresent and deeply malevolent entertainment machine, which he called the culture industry. Modern films, TV, radio, magazines, and now social media seemed for Adorno to be almost designed to keep us distracted, unable to understand ourselves, and without the will to alter political reality. So, for example, the news will feed us a mixture of salacious nonsense and political stories that scramble any possibility of understanding the open prison within which we exist. The cinema shows us the adventures of an alien invasion, while the real calamities of our world go unattended. Pop music focuses relentlessly on the emotions around romantic love, suggesting that happiness can only come from meeting one very special person, rather than awakening us to the pleasures of community and of a more broadly distributed human sympathy. We wander through museum galleries, privately unsure what they really mean and why we should care. The culture industry likes to keep us like that, distracted, pliant, confused, and a bit intimidated. Adorno perceptively described Walt Disney as the most dangerous man in America. Because of the huge range of consumer goods available in modern capitalism, we naturally suppose that everything we could possibly want is available. The only problem, if there is one, is that we can't afford it. But Adorno pointed out that our real wants are carefully shielded from us by capitalist industry, so that we end up forgetting what it is we truly need and settle instead for desires manufactured for us by corporations without any interest in our true welfare. Though we think we live in a world of plenty, what we really require to thrive, namely tenderness, understanding, calm, insight, community, all these things are in painfully short supply and are utterly disconnected from the present economy. When they're trying to sell us something, advertisers show us the thing that we really want and then connect it to something we don't actually need. So we can see an advert showing a group of friends walking along a beach, chatting amiably, or a family having a picnic and laughing warmly together. These adverts show us these things because they know we crave community and connection. But the industrial economy prefers to keep us lonely and consuming. So at the end of the adverts, we'll be urged to buy some 25-year-old whiskey or a car so powerful that no road would ever let us legally drive it at top speed. Adorno was writing at the dawn of the age of the psychological questionnaire. These were widely in use in the United States, where they were measuring consumer attitudes and commercial behavior. Adorno was intrigued by the underlying concept of the questionnaire, and so, together with colleagues, devoted himself to designing a rather different kind of questionnaire, one designed to spot fascists. The questionnaire that he designed asked contributors to assess their level of agreement with statements like, "Obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn," and "If people would talk less and work more, everybody would be better off," and "When a person has a problem or worry, it's best for him not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things." Given the traumas Germany had just been through, it's no surprise that Adorno gave his questionnaire and what he called the F scale, fascist scale, such attention. His team even sent the F scale to every school in West Germany. But a more widely applicable lesson to be drawn from this experiment is that psychology comes ahead of politics. Long before someone is racist, homophobic, or authoritarian, they are, Adorno skillfully suggested, likely to be suffering from psychological frailties and immaturities, which it's the task of a good society to get better at spotting and responding to. Rather than leaving problems to fester so long that there's eventually no way to deal with them other than through force, we should learn to understand the psychology of everyday insanity from the earliest moments. Adorno was a left-wing thinker who recognized that the primary obstacles to social progress are cultural and psychological rather than narrowly political or economic. we already have the money, the resources, the time, and the skills to make sure that everyone can sleep in a house, stop destroying the planet, is given a fulfilling job, and feel supported by the community. So the reason why we continue to suffer and hurt one another is first and foremost because our minds are sick. This is the continuing provocation offered by the beguiling and calmly furious work of Theodor Adorno. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the videos we produce at the School of Life, then may we suggest you visit our friends over at a channel called Wisecrack. They too create wonderful videos about philosophy, literature, cinema, psychology, and more, all with a cheeky twist. So click here to visit their channel, and we highly suggest that you subscribe. You might be especially interested in their show called 8-Bit Philosophy. Click here to watch their classic episode on Plato's Allegory of the Cave, as explained.
Okay. So how did you find it? So that's the general area within which Adorno works, and one of the main takeaways that we can use from that short introduction, I think that was maybe the best, not the best, but like the most readily accessible introduction to Adorno, is that forms of control are not always explicit. Like it's not always it's not always about, strong authority figures. Of course, there's Hitler. But then again, the conditions that allowed for Hitler to remain in power are those subtle forms of control that we sometimes take for granted. So his entire project is something that we may describe as an education towards autonomy. Now, to be completely transparent, uh, hold on, I'm just sharing the PowerPoint. Adorno is not an educational theorist, right? And Adorno did not dabble in education until the last maybe decades of his life, the last decade of his life. So it was quite an odd turn, right? Is quite an odd turn towards education because um, Adorno was starting to become different in terms of the tone of his writings, in so far as the language of his philosophy, of his social science, of his sociology. It becomes different because, for the most part, Adorno is a very pessimist thinker. So for Adorno, the task of social sciences is not always to provide solutions, right? And this is a very, you might think of it as something controversial, because then again, what about the problems? But that is precisely the point of Adorno. Sometimes the best thing that we could do, right, is to identify first the problems and to allow people to understand what these problems are. So this is why I was telling you a while ago that to my mind, Adorno tries to give us the red ink, because that's what we don't have. So he tries to give us the red ink. Right? He tries to give us the language through which we could articulate our problems. Because more often than not, that is something that is missing. That is something that is lacking. So the reason why I tell that there's a shift towards you know, the end of his life, towards the last decade, is because this one is appears to be quite a bit more hopeful that something can be done. No? So this is quite different. So we're going to talk about two essays. Actually, one is an essay, one is an interview. And the interview is it's a radio interview conducted by Helmut Becker, who was then the director of the Institute for Human Development in the Max Planck Society in Berlin. So human development is the German like term for education. Okay, it's called Bildungsforschung, like human development, human research. Um, so the conversation was broadcasted in Hessian radio, under the series titled Educational Questions for the Present. So the PDF that I gave you is actually a translation of the transcript of that conversation. So in this particular conversation between Adorno and Helmut Becker, they're trying to map education as an emancipatory program, isang mapagpalayang programa. Okay, and this is something that again Adorno never dealt with throughout his or throughout his works. This is something that you could see, for instance, in Paulo Freire. For those of you who know Freire, for those of you who know about a little bit about critical education studies, this is something that Freire was known for. How education can become emancipative. But this strange turn of Adorno towards education brings him into the fore of the emancipative capacity, the emancipative potential, yung mapagpalayang potential ng karunungan, ng edukasyon. Okay? And of course, later on we'll discuss, the viability of this kind of program in our age today. So in this conversation, Adorno and Becker try to map education as an emancipatory program against the backdrop of what they call an administered world governed by the rationality of domination. So maybe a quick word on rationality, because we sometimes tend to equate rationality or reason with the ratio of ancient Latin or ancient Greek, and we always think of rationality as rational. But we have to set aside our value judgments for rationality, because rationality is just reason. No, so that's why even long before Adorno, Marx, sometime in 1844, wrote to his friend and said, and I quote, although reason is always present, it is not always in rational form. So there's a distinction between the rationality that, when we say napaka-irrational naman ng mga ng mga supporters ni Marcos, napaka-irrational naman ng mga supporters ni Duterte, obvious na nga yung atrocities, ini-ignore pa rin nila. It's not that simple. Again, it's not in the Kantian sense just laziness and cowardice. And they're thinking through a different paradigm of rationality, one that makes sense for them. Kaya nga, the way I see this is that it is a language divide, because I think what the Robredo supporters were trying to do was trying to impose a certain paradigm of rationality against people who do not recognize it, who do not recognize the value of it. Kaya it doesn't work. Kaya nga, all of this blaming game, I really think is quite unproductive. I think it would always be better for us to think how we ourselves could be part of the problem. So this is like an effort to try and make sense of it all. Okay, so there's a rationality of domination in the world, and Adorno says this along with Max Horkheimer in the work Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it's an administered world, a governed world, not governed as in governed legally, but governed as in it is, it dictates, the society dictates how we should behave, how we should act, and so on. So the general theme of these two essays, I call it education towards autonomy or freedom as resistance. Sorry. In the essay education, so there are, again, maybe to provide further context, it might again become confusing, because why are we talking about autonomy here? In the previous essay, What is Enlightenment by Immanuel Kant, Kant doesn't actually use the German word autonomy. No, he uses Unmündigkeit. No? And we translated Unmündigkeit based on what Mundigkeit means. Mundigkeit means maturity and responsibility, while Unmündigkeit means the opposite of that. So why talk about autonomy? Because the other title, the other translation of this conversation between Becker and Adorno is Education for autonomy. I don't know if I don't have the PDF here, but I don't know if you can see this. There. Well, anyway, I'll upload a scanned copy of this probably, or I'll look for the PDF. The other translation, the earlier translation, because the German title of this conversation is Erziehung zur Mündigkeit. No? And the early translation of that is education towards autonomy, education for autonomy. But the more recent translation, translation in the 90s, translated it into education towards maturity and responsibility. So it's quite interesting that there's that kind of dynamic. The question is, why are we talking about autonomy here? Now, why are we talking about autonomy? Kant did not use the word autonomy, and Adorno certainly used the word Mundigkeit as well, not autonomy. So in the essay Education After Auschwitz, Adorno emphasizes that, and I quote, the single genuine power standing against the principle of Auschwitz is autonomy. If I might use the Kantian expression, the power of reflection, of self-determination, of not cooperating, right? So again, very brief background. What does freedom mean for Kant? What does autonomy mean for Kant? For Kant, for Immanuel Kant, if you have autonomy, you have to have the power of reflection. Because as I've mentioned to you last time, in order for you to decide whether you have to do something or not, you have to subject that action into the principle of universalization. What if the action that I want to do were to become a universal law? Would that favor the world? Would that favor, would that make sense? So one of Kant's examples was lying. What if I lie to get away from, what if I lie whenever it's convenient for me to get away, for instance, from paying my debt and so on? And Kant says, okay, if that is the case, if you want to do that, think about whether or what happens if it becomes a universal law. So if it becomes a universal law, everyone could just lie. And if that happens, there's no point in talking to people. There's no point in having a society, because you wouldn't know whether people are telling the truth or just telling a lie. So having autonomy for Kant doesn't simply mean, you do whatever you want. Having autonomy means having the power to reflect on your actions, on your planned actions, rather. So the other criterion is self-determination. Right? You are governed by your own self, and of not cooperating. And this is the more important part. Adorno describes autonomy as the power to not cooperate. And when you think about that, napaka-negative nung connotation yan, because halimbawa may group project tayo, and pagka yung mga estudyante may group project and then merong isang member na hindi nagpaparamdam o hindi nagpapakita. I don't know if you've had those, mini thesis group work kind of thing, tapos yung ambag lang ng iba ay pamerienda kunwari, no? Or sila na lang daw yung magpiprint, or sila na lang magre-report, and then there's conflict, there's drama, and then people say they're not cooperating. And to a certain extent, that's true. But what Adorno has here in mind when when he speaks of autonomy as the power not to cooperate is the idea that we have to resist authorities. Okay? Kasi remember that the context of this one is coming from a culture, from an ethos of obedience. When the Prussian Empire was still active, the Prussian people, the German people, had in mind that the word of the emperor, the word of Kaiser Friedrich, or whomever the emperor was, Friedrich Wilhelm, Friedrich Augustus, Friedrich Wilhelm the First, the Second, and so on. They think of the word of the emperor as the word of God. And you might think, well, malabo naman yung mangyari ngayon eh. But as a matter of fact, that culture of obedience, that ethos of obedience resurfaces today. We've for sure seen a lot of people defend the martial law by saying, well, kung marunong naman sumunod yung mga tao noon, hindi naman sila mapapahamak. Kaya kung si Marcos yung magiging, dahil nga ngayon si Marcos ang magiging presidente, hindi naman kailangang hindi naman kailangan matakot sa martial law kung wala kang masamang ginagawa. In the same way that people defended the drug war by saying hindi mo naman kailangan matakot sa police, kay Duterte, etc. kung wala kang masamang ginagawa. Sumunod ka lang. No? Which is, well, if you think about it, it's a very scary way of justifying strongman politics, right? When we had the so-called processing session with a couple of students and staff from the discipline of philosophy, there were some people who shared with us that, you know, their parents who voted for Marcos are sort of like, you know, bullying them because they voted for Robredo or they voted for another candidate. But at the same time, when 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 their children, becomes active in protest, becomes active in activism, um, these are the same parents who would warn their children na huwag ka masyadong uh, nagpa-participate sa mga ganyang activities kasi baka ipadampot ka sa police or and so on and so on. I think you get the picture. Which is profoundly ridiculous because these are the parents, these are the same, you know, adults who voted for Marcos in the first place. And so the culture of obedience is embedded. Not only did we want to obey, not only did some people want to obey, they desired obedience without even probably fully being aware of it. No? So if we are to take autonomy seriously, it has to start from the concept of not cooperating. If we are to determine ourselves, or in the words of Kant, if we are to use our own reason, then there needs to be some capacity in us, some will in us not to cooperate to systems of power that otherwise perpetuate the system of control. So, um, the use of the term Mundigkeit. So I was telling you a while ago that the title of the conversation is Erziehung zur Mundigkeit. The use of the term Mundigkeit in Adorno's conversation with Becker was indicative of a particular point of departure that Adorno wanted to use, and that point of departure was Kant's essay "What is Enlightenment?" Okay, and as we've read last Tuesday, the first line of that 1784 essay reads in German, no, Aufklärung ist der Ausgang der Menschen aus seiner selbst verschuldeten Unmündigkeit. Or in the translation that we read, enlightenment is man's emergence from self-incurred immaturity. So there's a connection between immaturity and being subjected to control. Right? There's a connection between those two things. And and so here we find in this particular train of thought of Adorno that there is a strong theoretical and operative link between autonomy, in the German word for autonomy, and Mündigkeit. And at first glance, it's not that evident because when we use the terms maturity and responsibility to think of Mündigkeit, it has a certain English baggage that we cannot otherwise, immediately get rid of. But if you look at the root word of Mundigkeit, Mundig has a connotation of coming of age. Okay. And the idea of coming of age has a very nuanced meaning in the period of enlightenment, because these are terms that are related to the capacity for, again, self-determination, self-reflection, and as such ultimately linked with autonomy. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, insights, inputs, or whatever, please feel free to interrupt me. I'd be more than happy to listen to what you have to say, to listen to your opinion. So again, the chat to everyone is now activated. So please feel free to use the chat, or just feel free to use the raise hand function or unmute yourself. Again, I'd be very happy to listen to what you have to say. Okay. So One thing that Adorno does in his conversation with Becker is that he was trying, I think, to revive this Kantian ideal of enlightenment. Again, I emphasize here the term ideal because Kant was very much critical of the age of enlightenment as it was. So he was distinguishing between the enlightened age and the age of enlightenment, and he wrote in the text that we are definitely in an age of enlightenment, but we are not yet in an enlightened age. So the difference is that Kant sees potentiality, but not yet actuality. Okay, so Adorno's understanding of autonomy takes its cue from Kant's concept of enlightenment. And enlightenment for Kant is in opposition to unmundigkeit, okay, to immaturity, to irresponsibility. If, according to Kant, enlightenment is man's emergence from self-incurred immaturity, okay, and by immaturity, he means the inability to use one's understanding without the guidance of another, then we could take autonomy to mean the capacity of people to use their own reason. So, as I was saying a while ago, um, Immanuel Kant wrote the essay, that 1784 essay, against the backdrop of a period in which forms of authority, such as the church and the state, have been exercising its control over the people. No? Kaya nga yung, let me stop this and show you that particular passage. Uh, right. So this one, right? This particular passage. Let's change the color so you could see. Okay. So again, Kant was writing again in that period of time where there are different forms of control, especially emanating from the powers such as the church and the state. So he starts here. He says, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such large population of men, even when nature has long emancipated them from alien guidance, external guidance, nevertheless gladly remain immature for life. For the same reasons, it is all too easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so convenient to be immature. If I have a book to have understanding in place of me, a spiritual advisor to have a conscience for me, a doctor to judge my diet for me, and so on, I need not make any efforts at all. I need not think so long as I can pay. Others will soon enough take the tiresome job for me. The guardians who have kindly taken upon themselves the work of supervision will soon see to it that by far the largest part of humankind, including the entire fair sex, should consider the step forward to maturity not only as difficult, but also as dangerous. So it's not just control, it's not just obey us. It's that if you refuse to obey us, if you think for your own, you will be led to a very dangerous path. No? So that's the idea. That's why Adorno says autonomy has, it's supposed to do something with not cooperating. Because the moment that you cooperate in this kind of setup, you accept their terms, right? You accept their terms about how the game should be played. So having first infatuated their domesticated animals and carefully prevented the docile creatures from daring to take a single step without the leading strings to which they are tied, they next show them the danger which threatens them if they try to walk unaided. Okay, so that's the control that Kant speaks of. It's not only the control that you have to that you have to follow. It's that if it's that if you don't follow, okay, you will be in a very dangerous position. So, nearly 2 centuries later, Adorno finds our society to be in the same condition. Okay. There are, as he says, overpowering mechanisms of control, right, that determine our everyday lives. In the German that he uses for this is quite beautiful. Übermächtigen Kontrollmechanismus. No? Overpowering mechanisms of control. And again, it's not just overpowering by force, by explicit force, but also overpowering in terms of ideas, right? That's how you control people. Okay. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci has a very wonderful analysis of this in his the prison notebooks, and he calls this the theory of hegemony. Because in again in ancient Greeks, hegemony means something very political, means something very territorial, geographical, etc. The master, di ba, when I talk to you, when I describe autonomy in ancient Greece as the city that can do its own, that can make its own laws. Now, if it makes laws to other cities, those kinds of cities that are recipient of such laws are called heteronymous cities. At the same time, the mother city is called the hegemon, no? Because the hegemon is the one responsible for creating those kinds of laws, which other cities should follow. So in Gramsci's idea of hegemony, people. It's not just that people are controlled by force; people are also controlled by ideas. Okay, that's why you see so many Duterte and Marcos supporters defend their ideas at an extreme level, defend their beliefs at an extreme level, because they are under that kind of hegemony, and they're not, unfortunately, aware of that. Um, Andrew says here, let me just read it. It appears that there is a certain burden to autonomy, sir. Also, sir, I'd like to add why these authorities attack ideas first. If people think alike, they would be easier to control and manipulate, a kind of reflective of what's happening right now. Would you like to elaborate on this, Andrew? This is quite an interesting analysis.
Um, Paano ba, sir? Parang sa sinabi niyo po earlier na what I mean is they try to protect their interests, of course. And if there is something we've been discussing throughout the semester with Pythagoras and other revolutionaries, that they would also protect the status quo and prevent radical ideas, because it would mean that their authorities and power would be questioned. So, of course, it's obvious that they would protect ideas, or they would attack these people or scholars perhaps. In modern times like us, they would attack people from the academe, or people who know the truth. So so parang I forgot what specific communication theory, pero that's what they do to condition people, society, to control ideas first. And if we think alike, siguro simple example is if there is a sale, or if there is an emerging trend, people would like to get into that trend or hop on bandwagoning or bandwagon. So if that we condition that, if they condition that, they would be likely to easier to be manipulated.
Thank you for that, Andrew. That was very brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I completely agree. Kasi nga, ano ba naman yung problema noon ng pandemya, yung kakulangan ng response ng gobyerno kung may namamayagpag na trend ng dalgona coffee, right? And that's a very Adornian way of thinking about it. That's why, for maybe those quote unquote uninitiated, they'd find Adorno very very annoying, very irritating, very dark and pessimistic, because he has all these negative view of the world. But sometimes that's a very interesting perspective to look at as well. No, if we learn to combat this kind of culture of toxic positivity, that everything will be fine. We just have to trust the system and so on. No, sometimes we have to understand that things are very problematic, right? And it goes back to what Zizek was saying, because yeah, the reason why we feel free is because we don't have the language to articulate that unfreedom. So everything is fine with us. No? um, Regarding the sinasabi ni Andrew, that's true. I mean, people in power try to preserve the status quo, and they do it by different ways. By capitalism does it by continuously reinventing itself. So now, maybe a decade or two ago, capitalism is being blamed for, oh, you know what, these large factories are causing irreparable damage to the environment, and so on and so on. And then after that, capitalism reinvents itself. So now we have the idea of green capitalism, or capitalism with a human face. you know a lot of people seem quite fond of Elon Musk, electric cars, the way to the future, and so on. But the problem is that what a lot of people don't understand is, while he makes electric cars, he sells his carbon credits to other companies, thereby allowing other companies to continue creating um, um, cars that emit basically the greenhouse gases that pollute the environment. Right? That's certainly another topic, but that's how the system gets preserved, because of the capacity of a power to reinvent itself. So, uh, you hear that in Trump, right? Trump basically controlled information by calling specific news outlets as fake news. Duterte did the same thing, right? Duterte did the same thing to Rappler, for instance. Of course, again, we have to be quite careful here in terms of saying that there is, the truth, there is the objective truth, and there's just the false narratives of it all. I'm not saying we have to be relativists. I'm saying that we can likewise be enslaved by that very idea of truth. And that's sort of how I analyze this kind of problem of divide between Robredo supporters and Marcos supporters. A lot of Robredo supporters would say that the people who supported Marcos are controlled by fake news. They subscribe to fake news, as if they're actively doing that. As if bumangon sila one day, okay, ano kayang magandang fake news ang ikalat ko ngayon? Of course, with the exception of the troll farms, that might be true for the case of the troll farms. But there are a lot of people who are so deeply immersed in this kind of narrative that for them, it is the truth. So the again, in psychoanalysis, the knowledge of the other is very important. No? In the same way that that in the same way that Marcos supporters are controlled by a particular kind of narrative, I think we have to understand that Robredo supporters are also, controlled by this language of truth, this language of facts, this language of credentials. And it's a language that is not spoken by a vast majority of the other camp. That's why it could not get through. And maybe the counter argument to that is, well, there were house to house campaigns, and sure, I'm not denying that. But then again, if you look at it from a deeply sociological, like, or social political analytic, that kind of house to house campaign is still not enough in terms of bridging the gap, because there's still this gate. In a way, a lot of it functions as big politics gatekeeping. We are from big politics coming to you, the small people, the minority, and we want to tell you why your initial decision or vote might be better given to our own candidate. I'm not saying that's universally the case. I'm saying there are cases like that. But again, that's not to suggest that their efforts are futile. I think it was a very good move to be able to mobilize that kind of initiative, that kind of project. But at the same time, there's always something to be learned. And when we say that there's always something to be learned, part of it is accepting how we ourselves could become part of the problem. No, so I mentioned something about psychoanalysis and the knowledge of the other. And let me just share something very quickly about that. So I think I could drive the point right here. This is a an interesting. Well, Slavoj Žižek is one of my like is one of the philosophers, psychoanalysts I study. He is a Hegelian, a Marxist, a psychoanalyst, a Lacanian. And this book I'm drawing from is actually just a collection of the jokes that he what do you call this? He delivers in his lectures, or he writes in his books. It exists in other books. This is not just, he did not just write this book as a collection of jokes. This was collected from all of the other writings he had done. So the reason why I source from this is because it's quite convenient to find what I want to use. So let me just read this very quickly. For decades, a classic joke has been circulating among Lacanians to exemplify the key role of the other's knowledge. So, for example, a man who believes himself to be a kernel of grain is taken to a mental institution where the doctors do their best to convince him that he is not a kernel of grain, but a man. However, when he is cured, he is now convinced that he is not a kernel of grain, but a man, and allowed to leave the hospital. He immediately comes back, trembling and very scared. There is a chicken outside the door, and he is afraid it will eat him. Sabi ng doctor, "My dear fellow, you know very well that you are not a kernel of grain, but you are a man." The patient replies, "Of course I know, but does the chicken?" In other words, does the chicken know that he is not a kernel of grain, but a man? So I don't know if you're able to follow that, but his explanation here is brilliant. He says, therein resides the true stake of psychoanalytic treatment. It is not enough to convince the patient about the unconscious truth of his symptoms. The unconscious itself must be brought to assume this truth. The same holds true for the Marxian theory of commodity fetishism. We can imagine a bourgeois subject attending a Marxism course where he is taught about commodity fetishism. After the course, he comes back to his teacher complaining that he is still a victim of commodity fetishism. Uh, for those of you who do not know what commodity fetishism means, it's something that, for Marx, in the early days of well, the reason why we trade products is because they have use value in them. But commodity fetishism happens when we attach certain other meaning to a product. For example, a top tier phone is representative of your social economic status. Where you study is, a lot of universities do this in the Philippines, especially, like its obsession with rankings. We are part of the QS world rankings or whatever. So you attach additional meanings to certain things that are otherwise simple. So that's commodity fetishism. So the teacher tells him, but you now know how these things stand, that commodities are only expressions of social relations, that there is nothing magic about them. To which the pupil replies, of course I know that, but the commodities I'm dealing with seem not to know it. This is what Lacan aimed at his claim that the true formula of materialism is not God doesn't exist, but God is unconscious. I'm not going to go too much into that Lacan thing, but I don't know if you are able to follow that. But the point of the story, the point of the anecdote, the point of the joke for Zizek is that you don't just convince them that they're you don't just convince other people that they're working on fake news. You don't just convince other people that it's just false narratives. Why can't you just accept our facts? And that's what I mean when I say that we are also governed by our facts, so much so that we cannot think outside of it. Anything that is outside of it is for us unthinkable, irrational. And by all means, by any stretch of the imagination, that's definitely irrational. Fake news is definitely irrational, but it operates perfectly in our world because of certain social conditions that allow for it to happen. And that's what we have to understand. Okay. And I've been plugging Nicole Corato and Jonathan Ong for I think since last Tuesday. So I urge you to listen to their research or their podcasts or maybe interviews about this architecture of network disinformation, because this is really helpful in allowing us to understand why it's not enough for us to berate other people for subscribing to fake news, as though in the Kantian sense they're only just lazy and coward to use their own understanding, as if when they use their own understanding they're automatically going to join the other camp. It's not as simple as that. They are already using their own understanding, but their own understanding is affected by an unconscious reality, which is that a deep-seated immersion into into fake narratives. So I mentioned Lacan. Jacques Lacan would say truth has the structure of a fiction, right? Uh, so again, to continue. Uh, So during this time, the 60s, the educational system of the Federal Republic, Bundesrepublik of Germany, the Federal Republic, it is grounded in a false understanding of ability. So sa atin kasi meron tayong kindergarten or preparatory school, grade school, high school. Ngayon may K to 12, o baka magka K to 14, and then college. But in Germany, it's different. They have a more complex educational system, which actually has its pros, if you think about it. So you have the kindergarten, you have the primary school, no, and then you have the secondary school. But the secondary school is divided into different categories. So for those who have high intellectual ability, those people who are sure to go to university, because in the German educational system, not everyone is expected to go to university, as opposed to for example, the case in the Philippines and other Southeast Asian or Asian countries. University education is indispensable. You have to have a an undergraduate degree in order for you to be able to have success in life, quote unquote. But in the Federal Republic of Germany, right at the outset, they classify students. Those with high intellectual ability go to the Gymnasium. Average ability go to the Realschule. Okay? And low ability go to Hauptschule. And it already the danger of this is that it already teaches them that we could classify people according to presupposed or predetermined categories. And so Adorno and Helmut Becker connects that, well, kung sa educational system kaya natin nangyayari itong classification, what more in the wider stage of reality? It would be so much easy to say we're Germans, you're Jews. No? You're not allowed to walk on the same pavement as us. So they trace it back to the institutional problems, and you might think about it. Well, it's something simple. They just wanted to classify which students should go to which type of high school. But for Adorno, this is the start. This is the start of discrimination. This is the start of atrocities. Okay. So according to Helmut Becker, ability in humans is not predetermined, but rather development depends on the challenges to which the individual is exposed. So hindi pwedeng ikukulong lang natin sila doon, no? So if we accept the thesis that ability can be developed, the same could likewise be said about autonomy. Freedom could, sorry, freedom could likewise be developed through motivation. So Adorno argues it is important to see this delimiting phenomenon from a broader perspective. Institutions themselves have become overpowering mechanisms of control, or what he calls übermächtigen Kontrollmechanismus. So if there are societies of control, if there are, well, the term is from Gilles Deleuze, control society, but if there are institutions that control us, no? Antonio Gramsci and the French post-Marxist Louis Althusser would say these are repressive and ideological state apparatuses. How do we cultivate freedom there? So again, in our context today, how do we cultivate autonomy? How do we cultivate the power of not cooperating? Yeah. Sorry, I have 5 minutes against the backdrop of a period, that the backdrop of a situation wherein obedience is expected, wherein fake news is proliferated. How do we cultivate freedom for that? According to Adorno, no, and here, if you have a bit of understanding of like the history of philosophy, an appreciation of paradoxes, of irony, of contradiction, something which Adorno seems to inherit from Hegel, is quite important here. According to Adorno, the basic requirements for maturity on which a free society depends are governed by the lack of freedom in society. Again, that's an ontological dialectical justification of our torn reality. Freedom cannot arise independently of unfreedom. Freedom must arise out of unfreedom. So we have to accept first the necessity, again, not the moral necessity, but the ontological necessity of unfreedom, of the situation of unfreedom. We have to recognize it as it is. And then from then, if we recognize it as it is, then it is possible to actually understand how to transcend it, how to go beyond it. So in his work, Negative, so this is a notion of a truth that is at odds with itself. And it is the most significant aspect, sorry, of dialectical thinking. And without abandoning it, according to Adorno in Negative Dialectics, we can think against our own thought. No, that's in terms of reflecting about these problems. This is what dialectical means. Think against our own thought. If our own thought is to, whatever it is, the capacity to enact dialectics in our thinking would be to think against it. Or Adorno's love of paradox is manifested in his, in his quotation of F.H. Bradley's aphorism. Sabi niya, where everything is bad, it must be good to know the worst. How can that be? Everything is already bad. If everything is bad, how can there be something good about everything that is already bad? So the truth lies within it, but at the same time comes external to it. Okay. So in this sense, it is important to understand Mundigkeit and Unmundigkeit, maturity and immaturity, irresponsibility and responsibility, independence and dependence, freedom and unfreedom, autonomy and heteronomy. These are concepts and phenomena that are co-constitutive of each other. Adorno's use of Mundigkeit, by which he sets out to define only by implication as the opposite of Unmundigkeit in Kant, is a hint of his use of determinate negation. And this is another philosophical concept. We can understand something by what it is not. The negation is informative and brings a positive feature to the term, right? We can only understand freedom by what it is not, by arising out of unfreedom. So autonomy therefore cannot develop independently from the conditions which prevent it. It has to develop out of it, right? So I have, well, seven, yeah, I have 7 more slides left. But I'm afraid we are not able to continue because it's already time. We have a minute left. Does anyone have any maybe thoughts or questions or insights or comments? Anything? Okay, if you have, as always, feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you. I did mention that we are supposed to talk about the mechanics for the final exam today. So I'll probably send that later today and then we'll just discuss it next Tuesday. Okay. Okay, so if there are no more thoughts, insights, questions, or suggestions, you are now dismissed. Thank you for being here. I hope we are able to get at something quite interesting for you. And I hope to see you again next week.